when I look back and I see the infant that's killed in a car wreck, I understand that that's not God's fault, and I think it's important for us to understand that God did not design this, but it's because of our own doing, our own sin, that this is taking place. So that's one of the ways that I was able to not blame God for these different things, saying, why would you let this happen? God never intended for any of this. This is because of our own doing, that we have this mess that we're dealing with.
Welcome to Faith in the Line of Duty, a podcast where real people in uniform share how their faith in Christ has carried them through the toughest moments. I'm Daniel Johnson, husband, father, and currently active duty in the United States Air Force. Each episode, I sit down with military members and first responders to talk about the power of the gospel, the strength of community, and how faith transforms lives, even in the line of duty.
The views expressed in this podcast are those of the host and do not constitute endorsement by the Department of Defense, Department of the Air Force, or the U.S. government. Now here's your host, Daniel Johnson.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Faith in the Line of Duty. I'm your host, Daniel Johnson, and I'm honored to have you here with us today. Thank you for tuning in to hear these powerful stories of faith, service, and courage from those who have stood on the front lines. Today's guest is someone who's worn many hats over the years. Firefighter, chaplain, community leader, and currently the lead pastor of Victory Christian Center in Phillips, Wisconsin. His journey began back in 2004 as a firefighter. Over the next decade, he rose through the ranks to become a captain, training officer, and earning numerous certifications along the way, before stepping away from firefighting in 2014. Since 2018, he has been serving full-time ministry. He became a youth pastor in 2010, and throughout his time in ministry, he earned his extorter's license. And when he became licensed in ministry and is now an ordained minister. In addition to pastoring, he serves as the chaplain for both a law enforcement agency and a correction center, roles that place him directly alongside people facing life's toughest battles. He also leads the Phillips Area Clergy Association, and in 2023 launched a men's recovery ministry that's making a real impact in his community. He has also had a huge impact on me as my youth pastor growing up. We're really excited to have you here today. I appreciate you coming on.
Wow. It's a blessing. It's just, it's fun to see you mature and you grow in your faith, but also your line of work, and it's just the adventures that you've had already, the countries you've seen and everything else so it's a blessing for me too. So thanks for having me on.
Definitely. So I think I just want to start off just, your faith journey and, how you came to know Jesus.
Sure. Yeah, so I grew up in a very traditional Christian home. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, is where I was born and raised for the majority of my life. Grew up in the Assembly of God Church, and Mom and Dad, they met in the church that I was born in, and I stayed there for many years. The only drug problem I ever had was being drugged to church unwillingly as a kid. Unfortunately, I didn't really solidify my faith until after I got out of high school. I was active in the youth group. Don't get me wrong. I met my wife there, but it really never became my faith, my personal connection to Jesus, until later on, probably in my late 20s, if I had to guess. I don't exactly have the date of when that was, but I found myself in the back of a church parking lot screaming at the sky, and I got real with God that night, and that's the same night that God got real with me and took me on a whirlwind adventure to bring me to where I'm at today. And it's amazing when a person gets real, God's there, so it's really a big blessing for that part.
Yeah, and I grew up in church, all my life too, and there's always that point of surrender, but what caused you to get to that point where you were saying, hey, I can't do this on my own? Right,
yeah, so I was definitely in my 20s. I built a house, so I was a firefighter at this point. So it's been 2004 and beyond. I couldn't tell you exactly how far. But I felt, and I keep saying because that's where it was, I felt like I had the world by the tail. I had a great job doing construction. I finally was able to get on the fire department, something I've always really wanted to do. I just always wanted to give back, but also the adrenaline rush that, if we're going to be honest, that's part of the game, is getting that shot of adrenaline whenever you need it. I had money, I had a job, I had a wife and kids, I had a dog, and I had everything I needed. And it was until one weekend, my world came crashing down around me. I was on my way home from work, driving home in my Ford pickup, and it quit on the highway, just like done. And I had no idea what was going on with this thing. I'm not a mechanic. So I left it on the side of the highway, had to get it towed home. It turned out to be the ECM, went out on the truck. And the year of my truck, they had no ECMs left. It was beyond the years that they kept it in stock or whatever. So that's not as terrible as it sounds. Okay, fine, one car breaking down, that's typical, right? Well, this is a Friday, so I began to mow my yard for Saturday. And Saturday, I was riding my lawnmower. Well, that one blew up. My engine on the lawnmower blew up.
Wow.
So I was really bummed. I was like, dude, this stinks, So I decided, well, at least I can mow my ditch. So I got the push mower out, and as I'm mowing the push mower, somebody threw a steel rod in my yard I didn't see, and I bent the shaft of my push mower. So I'm down 2 pieces of lawn equipment. I'm like, dude, this is not looking good for me right now. So I began to weed eat around the trees and the ditch line that way, and as I'm weed eating, the carburetor or the gas line, gave way, and now I have a ball of flame under my armpit, and I throw that in the yard, and I'm going, what the heck is going on, man? It's like everything I touch just falls to ashes, essentially. Then Angie's car breaks down that same afternoon. I can't remember what's wrong with her car. So we're down 2 vehicles, and every single lawn equipment that I could possibly, even have, it's gone. So I'm like, this may be a sign. Just throwing that out there. Maybe I should get my life right. So I called my mom and dad. They had an extra vehicle, so I borrowed the extra vehicle. At this point, I tell my wife, I said, I'm not driving nothing. I ain't touching nothing. You're driving to church, right? So we're driving down Highway 61, coming out of Yulia, and heading down south, and my wife's driving. Well, there's a police car on the shoulder, had somebody pulled over, so we merge over to the passing lane. And as she does that, she crosses a hill, and there's a dead deer in the middle of the road. So she runs over this dead deer, and unbeknownst to us, it punctures the gas tank of my mom's vehicle. So we get to pull into the church parking lot, and gas is just gushing out. I pull the kids out. I get my wife out of there, and I'm watching this thing. I'm going, what the world is going on, man? It's nuts to me about what God's doing here. So that's the night. I was waiting for the tow truck with my father because I had to call him to come pick up the kids. So I'm sitting back in the parking lot, and I'm screaming at this guy, what else do you want from me, God? What are you trying to do to me? And my dad puts his hand on my shoulder, and he's like, be careful what you say, And I really, I was lost. Because everything that I thought I held, that I did, was crashing to the floor faster than I could even see it coming back to life. So I opted to just go ahead and stay at the church, for the night for the service. And it was a Sunday night service at that point, and I rededicated my life to Christ, and I'm like, I don't know what you're doing here, but I can't fight against God any longer. So now I'm without any vehicle. I can't even take Mom's car to work tomorrow because it has a punctured gas tank. And that night, I had a gentleman, young kid, 18 maybe, never seen this kid before in my life. He walks in the back of the church, and Pastor Kelly finishes up, and he goes, can I help you? He goes, I'm out bow hunting. So this is about the time of year, so September, October, He goes, I was out bow hunting, and I felt like the Lord told me to bring a set of keys and a title to this church for some reason. Well, wow. It became the waterworks over me. I was just bawling like a little girl. And Pastor Kelly looks at me. He goes, "Looks like you're going to work tomorrow." And this wasn't a fancy brand new truck, but it got me to work, and I realized that God does care. And all these things that I thought that I had under control, I really never did. God was entrusting it into my care. So that brought me onto this whirlwind of an adventure that I found myself, the more real I got with God, the more raw I got, just bearing all of my ugliness. God was there every step of the way. And so that night I said, God, remind me, or bring me back to where you wanted me to be, and he reminded me back on the call that he had with me being a youth pastor, and that began that journey. Now, I didn't become a youth pastor instantaneously, but I just okay. But the amazing thing is the years that it took for me to get to the darkness I was in, God rectified instantaneous. It was just such a blur to me on the speed of which it was. And I think that's such an encouragement to each one of us to know that it doesn't matter how far you have fallen away from God or drifted away from God. God's right there behind that door waiting for you just to turn around and say, I quit, I give up. And he can make such a beautiful, a beautiful thing out of your life that you think is a chaotic mess. God says, watch me, watch what I can do. So that's, in a nutshell, the beginning stages of ministry and my life being relaunched with Jesus. But anyway, there's the gist of the story. Wow. Probably a little more than you were expecting, but that was my answer.
No, I love it. And so after you made that choice and you surrendered your life to God, how did your relationship change, with your wife and your kids? How was it different after you made that choice?
Right. So it took time, because of my selfishness. It took a lot of time to rebuild trust in that relationship. I was also dealing with a bunch of anger issues, things that I didn't know that were abnormal because I was used to them already. I'd have just fits of rage, just yelling, screaming, acting a fool. That didn't get rectified for probably a couple of years later until I really got some help with that part of it, and we can explore that if you'd like to at some point. But but it was a process. It wasn't like a magic wand and everything. Poof, everything's great and glorious, because we still had some work to do. And I think that's the part that Christianity sometimes gets the wrong reputation or understanding. That yes, Jesus came into my life and I got on the right track. But I still had to give up my old life and retrain my brain, my life, my relationships to bring them back to where they should be, and then I had to reestablish that trust with my family.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. And so for the age that I'm at right now, being a younger dad, what would be some advice you would give to some Christian dads out there? What would be your one piece of advice?
I'm going to give you the same advice that one of the men's leader in my life gave me. And the advice was your kids need to be able to trust your actions, but also your reactions to things. When he made that statement during a men's group that night, it really resonated with me because I can preach a pretty good, do this, or this, whatever. But how I react to situations is equally as important than just my lessons. So that's what I would say, that making sure that your words and your life line up to what you're preaching to your own kids. None of us like to be called hypocrites, but in every single person's a hypocrite in some manner, one way or the other. Until we all go home to see Jesus, we're going to have some hypocritical moments in our lives, if we're going to be honest about it. But that would be the biggest thing, is making sure that you are walking the line that you're asking other people to lead, or to follow rather, because ultimately, as a dad, as a husband, you're the spiritual leader of the house. Your first and main priority is to lead that house well. So I take that very personally now. I didn't understand the fullness of that when I first became a dad, back in '99, which is many years ago. But as I progressed through my faith and my faith journey, I really got a better understanding of what that responsibility is as a dad, as a husband, as that spiritual head. So I think it's really important for us as men to come alongside each other also, to encourage, especially young dads. My kids are having kids now. My youngest one is ready to have a baby boy in about 2 weeks, maybe. So it's exciting for that, so he's just now starting the adventure of getting into fatherhood, and my biggest prayer is like, don't follow my early example, please, whatever you do, follow my later example where I actually had my head on straight. But that's the way I would say it, and just making sure that you are walking the line that you're asking everyone else to walk.
Oh, that's really good advice. Wow. So, what was the point where you you said it was like a slow process for you to become a youth pastor, but when was the moment when you were like, okay, I'm going to start this, and how was that whenever you first started that?
So that would probably be, it would have been 2010. I know that part. So it's probably middle of the year, roughly. I'd say maybe July-ish, somewhere in there. I just really felt in my heart that this is what God's telling me to do. So I was at the altar praying one Sunday morning, and kind of funny. So I was praying, and I felt the Lord saying, I want you to be the youth pastor of this church. Now, obviously, there was an opening, for this to take place, and I told God, I said, I'm not saying no, okay, but I don't want to just because there's an opening, and I know that when I was 15 years old, it was a very clear call in my life to into ministry. I was at a Perry Stone conference in Missouri, and I just asked the Lord that day, what do you want to do with my life? And it's as clear as you and I are talking today. He said, I want you to be a youth pastor. So, at this point, 15 years pass, and I still, being that, obedient servant, I was going in my own direction, right? So now I'm sitting at the altar, and I said, okay, God, I'll do it, but there's one thing. I want someone to call me this week and confirm that with me. Just call me and say, hey, this is what God's telling you to do. So I'm not saying no. I just want confirmation, because I don't want to step out here and it be in the flesh, right? Well, that was a Sunday. That Wednesday night, I'm on the couch, and the phone rings, and it's Pastor Kelly. So Pastor Kelly, he's like, hey, I've been telling the board this for a little while. I figured you should probably know, but you're the new youth pastor for our church. And instant waterworks again. I mean, I'm bawling oh my gosh, it was just uncontrollably. And he's like, you okay? And I said, and I explained to him that I prayed this literal prayer on Sunday morning that I want someone to call me, and here you are calling me. Now, his response was priceless. He's like, okay, well, sounds good. You have a good day. I'm like no big deal to him that like God had just opened up the heavens and spoken to me, because he's used to it. He knows that this is how God works. God just speaks to his people, right? So it's just amazing to me that God didn't throw me away after 15 years of out in the desert doing my own thing. He called me back in, and that began the journey. So Pastor Kelly stayed with me for several months. And then after those several months have passed, about October-ish, he's like, okay, it's time for you to do this on your own, and that's pretty much how I met you in that time frame, so that's been a few weeks ago.
You ever think about what would happen if you just didn't obey God and, listen to what he was, telling you to do?
I have thought about that, weighing out the options. Would God be upset with me? No, because that's not how God operates, But I wouldn't be living in the fullness of his will, And that's the biggest thing, is when you start walking in the will of God, it doesn't mean your life's simple or easy, If anything, it's the opposite. You go back to how the disciples lived and how they died, martyrs. All but one was martyred for their faith. So it's not that God's calling you into a easier life, because it's not. But it's a more enriching, fulfilling, life that I couldn't imagine my life right now outside of ministry, honestly. I mean, I enjoy ministry so much, and the different, as you said in your intro, all the different hats that I wear. Each one of those are equally important to me, that I'm like, what a blessing it is for God to use me, of all people, just a dude from Missouri that, pounded nails and fought fires. That's where I brought to the table. And God's like, watch what I can do through you, and it is. I think about that sometimes, going, what would my life be like had I not do this? I don't even want to think about it, honestly. I am so thrilled to be all in and watch what God can do, through me.
Yeah, definitely. And the impact you've had on me is just incredible. I mean, I remember I can't even, I could go on and on and on about the stories of, what the youth group, taught me and, along with my sister too, and, yeah, your impact was great. And I definitely miss those days for sure. So you talked about how, this is what God was telling you to do. And, not everybody is meant to be a pastor. A lot of people have, work and jobs, but what would you tell what would you tell someone who is trying to figure out what God has for their life? We're supposed to use our spiritual gifts, but what would be a kind of like a roadmap for someone to kind of navigate, what God has for their life?
So this morning, in fact, I gave a spiritual gift test to some of the guys over at the Rehab center that we launched last year. And having that on paper saying, okay, so I am gifted and talented in these areas. And usually this type of test will line up with things that you already enjoy or good at, okay? And you're right, not everybody's called to be a pastor. There's a reason why everyone's given different gifts, different talents. Because if it was just a world full of pastors, what a boring place. Okay, we have bad jokes, and normally we don't know anything about fashion. Okay, so most of the time we need other people to fill in these gaps of ministry. You look at what the Bible talks about is the body of Christ. Everybody works together, right? So I'm the pinky toe of the body, right? If I'm that. And everyone else is going to fill in these blanks, but no one is obsolete. No one is overlooked. We need every part of the body. So back to your original question was, how do you find out what your gift is? Try something out. Okay. Spend time with God, number one. Let him speak to you, and just be still. One of the best advice you can possibly get is to be still before the Lord. Okay. In the world we live in, our mind is constantly going 100 miles an hour, nonstop. God spends a lot of time speaking to me at 3 o'clock in the morning. I mean, boom, 3 o'clock on the nose. I wake up. We know that the Lord's speaking something. Okay, so I got to go find a quiet place and just listen. And if the Lord's telling you to start doing something or step into a role, talk to your local pastor. Say, hey, I'd like to serve in some capacity. Where do you think I can fit? Allow that man to be able to speak into your life as well. And if it starts out just in a role of being a door greeter or an usher or a Sunday school teacher, something, start somewhere. Because you never know where that's going to lead. Because even looking back at my journey, right out of high school, after me and Angie got married, I started doing youth ministry as an assistant. Really, I think they called it sponsors, is what they were called, and I got my feet wet with that part of it to see if I'd even like it. And after that, I went my own direction and started, trying to live life for myself. So, but at least I understood what that would look like. So start somewhere, and if it's not for you, I think you're going to know pretty quickly. You're not going to enjoy it. There's not going to be any fruit, because this is beyond your age gap, but I tried Sunday school teaching one time while I was in youth ministry, and that was terrible. Oh my gosh, these kids would not stop moving or talking. I'm like, this is not working well for me, and I found out that my age bracket is junior high and above. I can work well with those kind of kids and those adults, even. But other people are completely gifted in junior high and below, So just try it out. What's the harm? What's the harm in that one? The only way you're not going to succeed is by doing nothing. At least give it a shot. And if it ain't for you, who cares? Start something else. Do something else. Whatever you're doing, just do it for the glory of God.
Yeah. No, it's really good advice. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So I think I want to take a different step into, your time as a firefighter. What made you want to do that other than, rather than the other, first responder roles like a police officer or EMS?
Yeah, so I don't know where it began originally, like when I was a kid or whatever, but I've always desired to help the community, help people out. That's something that God instilled inside of me, and again, goes back to those spiritual gifts, right? That overwhelming feeling of helping someone else, and that was a part of my heart for many years. So while I was living in Moscow Mills, I thought about that. But it wasn't until I built a house in Eolia, I moved up there to Price County, or Pike County, rather, Illinois, or Missouri, excuse me, that I was given the opportunity. You know, my neighbor, I think he was a captain at the time. He came over to me after I got settled into my house, and he just asked me, he goes, have you ever thought about becoming a firefighter? You know, and that was a Thursday evening, and I'm like, yes, I have. I never was given the opportunity. He goes, why don't you come down here, fill an application, and come talk to us. So that was 2004. And I began the journey that night. You know, they accepted me, gave me a pager, because it was a volunteer department is what it was, so it wasn't a paid department. And we ran a couple hundred calls probably a year and just had a lot of fun doing everything. But that was the beginning stages of it, was just a desire to help others. I really didn't understand the adrenaline side of it until I got into it. And that's the part that's an addictive part. It's just like you're waiting for the next call to drop. And unfortunately, you know, and I understand that, you know, the days that I get adrenaline dump is because another person's having a terrible day. That's that weird balance that I had to hold in my life, that I'm not praying that someone has a bad day, but I'm very thankful that me and my other guys and the teams were able to help them in that capacity. So that's kind of my beginning journey, was there, of knowing nothing about firefighting. I had no idea about a forward lay, reverse lay. I mean, nothing. I was like, I have no idea. I'm never going to learn these things. And stand next to the pumpers, I'm like, how the heck am I ever going to learn how these levers even work? But because of the patience of my chief and my other, you know, training officers and everything else, they walked beside me every step of the way, and, you know, led me down the road of where I ended up. You know, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I remember when we went fishing with me, you, and Gabe and Joey, and we're just coming right back, and all of a sudden a call comes out, and, you know, you're talking on the radio. I didn't know what you were saying, you know, but, you know, just kicked on, and you were just running code, and, you know, I could just tell, yeah, this is what this guy, you know,
A correction, I was running the speed limit, not.
Yes.
I don't know where the statute of limitations is for speed limits or speed tickets, so I don't want to get myself in trouble. So,
but yeah, I remember
it was
just being locked in and just ready to go, ready to help people. So that's pretty cool. What would you say was your the best part of being a firefighter?
It's really a tie, to be honest with you, because it's hard to put them in different categories because they are separate. One is that brotherhood within the department. You know, we became family. Unfortunately, I was able to do the funeral service for one of my best friends that was also a captain. But being in other people's weddings, you know, I was in the chief's wedding, and we had. When we built our new Station 1, we made sure we had bunk rooms, we had a living room, a kitchen that our first station didn't have. It was just a shell of a building that held trucks. And we found ourselves spending more time together there than on calls, you know, where before it was just, you know, the job was all we were doing. So we had a basketball hoop out front for, you know, the younger kids or even the adults to act silly. And that brotherhood was the biggest thing, because I think a lot of people are looking for that brotherhood. I wasn't former military, so I can't speak into that, but I would imagine that's similar of what you guys have for the military side, of just that connection to people outside of yourself and your blood kin, and have that common denominator. But I would say equal to that would be the feeling of accomplishment, knowing that you helped a person in need that they could not help themselves. So that there's a balance there of working together as a team, but also, you know, being able to utilize the skills and the gifts that God's given you to help people in a tragedy, fires, car wrecks, medicals, whatever it is. That would be, you know, in those two camps, and it really is a toss-up between which one's better or more important to me, because it was a tie. If I never had a call, I would still I would love having the family atmosphere.
Yeah. So for people that, you know, just see, you know, firefighters as they're driving down the road, whether it's a wreck or a fire, what's something that people don't often see that's like a big part of your job?
The aftermath, the memories you take home.
Mm-hmm.
You know, no one really prepared me for that part, you know. I'm going to try not to cry on screen here, but there's many calls that I go home wishing I would have done something different, better, wish I could have done something. And 99% of the time, there's nothing I could do to change the outcome, right? Whether they were dead before I got there or I don't have a full hospital waiting for me, you know, on the right side of the road. That's the part that's hard to realize, that there's sometimes you can't do anything, you know, and this is what it is, you know, and I wasn't prepared for that part at all. And I don't think anybody really understands that, you know, because, you know, to like little kids, you see policemen and firemen as superheroes, you know, like they're invincible. Yeah, our kryptonite is right here.
Yeah. And so how would you say, as a Christian, how do you navigate that? It's really tough. And, how would you navigate that, seeing something so traumatic, and then, wondering, why would God do this? Why would he allow this to happen?
Sure. Yeah, so I have a very healthy understanding of the fall of mankind. You know, with the Garden of Eden, it's not just about eating an apple. It's the demise of mankind and taking what God created as perfect. Okay, so I mean, you go back to the end of the sixth day, he looked at what he created and he said it was very good. There was no sin, there's no corruption, there's no death, there's no car wrecks, there's none of that kind of stuff going on, right? So when I look back and I see the infant that's killed in a car wreck, I understand that that's not God's fault, and I think it's important for us to understand that God did not design this, but it's because of our own doing, our own sin, that this is taking place. So that's one of the ways that I was able to not blame God for these different things, saying, why would you let this happen? God never intended for any of this. This is because of our own doing, that we have this mess that we're dealing with. That's not to say God's not allowing things to take place. God allows what we allow, but he's not the root cause of it. He didn't cause the car wreck. He didn't cause the heart attack. He didn't cause, these, disasters that we have in our lives. That's on us. But he's there to help us clean up the mess, which is a huge benefit on that aspect of it. And that's what I would do, is I take it back to God and help me deal with this, in my own mind, help the other guys, that kind of stuff.
And what would you say, that's really good. And what would you say for, some practical, advice for, someone to do, so that way they're not filling that void, with, drinking or other things that, doesn't lead to anything good. Yeah.
No, I think that the best advice for that part was to talk to somebody, and that's, we didn't have a formal chaplain on our department, a fire department, and after I left the department, that was one of those things that I wish we had. I acted as such, we had another gentleman there for a short time that was our chaplain. But he moved to Southern Missouri shortly after I joined the department. So after I got out of firefighting, and I moved up here to Wisconsin, I had that nagging feeling of like, what else could I do to help people, right? And that's where becoming a chaplain for the law enforcement came into play. So when I do ride-alongs with sheriff and officers from the PD, that's usually their question. What are you doing? What are you doing this for? Because you're not getting paid. And the answer is always the same. I know what it's like to have a really bad day and have nobody to talk to. So that's my first bit of advice, is say, find someone that you can talk to, whether it be a higher up in the ranks, a peer, a pastor is a good point for that. And I may end up pointing you toward a pastor more often, just because of the confidentiality that we must hold as clergy. What you say stays there, so you can spill your guts about how angry and whatever you feel, and leave it at that doorstep. And that's one of the gifts of a pastor, is to be able to take that burden and bring it to the Lord and point you in the right direction. But also a solid prayer life, spending time with God, knowing Him as Father. Now, unfortunately, in the society that we live in, fathers are sometimes absent or not a very good role model in a home. So when we use the word father, especially with God, it sometimes has a negative connotation to people. But move past that. Go back to God as our loving Father who's perfect and loves us unconditionally. So having that communication with God, but also with peers, is probably the utmost importance for your longevity. Otherwise, burnout's inevitable. You're going to see some stuff and experience some stuff that's going to burn you out long before you're able to. Then you should check out, because you can't digest all of this by yourself.
Wow. Yeah, I love that. That's really good. So how would you, turn that switch off when you get home, from the, the stress of it, and then just being able to come home and, just change, cause I remember, when I worked as a civilian police officer for a little while, I was always, hyper vigilant, out there making traffic stops, and, you never know, when it's going to be the time where, something's going to happen. You got to always be on alert, but that's something I found a little difficult. But yeah, what would you say for that? What would you do?
It's hard to switch that mode off, because even when you think you're off duty, even when you think that you're you're just relaxing, chances are you never go to a restaurant with your back to your door. Most people in law enforcement or any kind of first responder don't. They're watching the door. They're thinking about options. What if this happens? Because you're vigilant no matter what scenario you're in. And it is difficult to switch that off. So I'm going from, running and gunning firefighter, to now I'm becoming dad again. And that's a very hard line to hold. And I wasn't able to do this at the time because I had to just kind of come down slowly. But a friend of mine, he has a mental thing he goes through when he gets into from work. He comes in and he pretends to hang up his coat that says I'm at work, and he puts on his hat that says Dad. So he goes through those literal motions before he walks into the door to tell himself, even subconsciously, I'm in a different role now. I need to act differently. But it is hard. It's really hard to switch that mode off, especially if it's a high energy situation that you just came out of. You go from, pulling people out of a burning building to go play Scrabble with the kids. That's a humongous dump and emotional thing. So having that understanding with hopefully a loving spouse that can understand a little bit and to help digest some of the stuff. So I really don't have great advice for that one because I didn't do that one very well.
No, I think that's good. I'm going to have to do that for sure. One last question about your time for firefighting. What would be your most memorable call that you went on?
Good or bad?
Let's stick with good.
Okay. All right. Let's see here. Actually, it's going to be a mix of good and bad, to be honest with this one. So we had, it was a car wreck rollover. Some of the occupants were ejected. One little girl was ejected, but she loved baseball. And I literally was watching the Cardinals baseball game beforehand. So I was able to stay next to her as the rest of the EMTs were hooking up her IVs and everything else. And be able to just talk baseball with her. And she was, I don't know, a little bitty thing, maybe 7, 8 years old. And that, I was in firefighter mode, but I was also being dad, if that makes sense,
Yeah.
So that's one of those memories that stick out to me. Unfortunately, the little girl did die later on at the hospital because of her injuries. And we knew that ahead of time. We already had a few other really major, injuries within that car. But I feel like I gave some kind of peace to at least the little girl, that her mind wasn't on the tragedy she just experienced and went back to something she loved, just baseball, So that was one of those memories that I know that I made a difference in the moment, not so much with the outcome, if that makes sense. I don't think there's anything we could have done to change the outcome.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that and being vulnerable and being willing to share.
And it's weird when you start thinking back on these memories, the emotions that are still attached to it. And that's been how many years ago? 2000, was it 14? That's been a minute, and here we are still thinking about those. And I think it's important for those that are in law enforcement, first responders, military, to understand that these emotions are going to last a while, and being able to deal with those is in a healthy manner, like you said before. Not dealing with pills and bottles. That's going to mask the true underlying issues. Having a good outlet to be able to talk about these things and deal with these raw emotions in a healthy manner is really vitally important.
So I want to dive into a little bit about the prison ministry that you started. What kind of started that?
So I didn't start the jail ministry. I didn't start that when I was introduced with that when I first arrived here in Phillips. The recovery center, I'm not sure which one you were asking about, the rehab center, we did launch that. We started the process in 23 and we opened our doors in 24. So I'm not quite sure which one you were referring to on that one.
Yeah, the one that you helped start.
Okay. So that would be the men's rehab. So it's His House of Hope. And that's out of here in Phillips, Wisconsin. That was birthed due to the need that I could see because of the jail ministry that I was a part of. I can see that a lot of these guys and girls were coming through the jail system on a regular basis, and they had no real alternative to get off of the life of drugs and that kind of stuff. And the Lord just started birthing in me, probably close to 19 to 20 is when he really started stirring with me. I talked with a few other pastors about it. And I'm like, what can we do here? So I began to pray. And then in 2023, I brought that to our PACA meeting, which is our Phillips Area Clergy Association. And I said, here's what I'd like to see done in our community is not our church doing it. I wanted to start this thing because as a community event or a community outreach rather, because it's a community problem. I didn't want just Victory, getting all the burden or all the credit for it because I want to work as a body, and so I began to talk to other pastors. And in 2023, me and 3 other pastors came together and began to formulate what this would look like and put the legwork in and was where we're at today. And it's just amazing to see what God can do with lives that are yielded to Him. Right now we got 5 guys in the program. Our capacity's 8. And the guys that's in there are just thriving. They went from a life of destruction and drug abuse and alcohol abuse to now living a full, healthy life with their families. One individual's getting married in December. So it's just amazing what God's doing that way.
And, it kind of goes back to it, all of this is led just because you were obedient to God and, your life has just completely changed. It's just very encouraging to hear all that. For sure.
And what God's done with me is nothing. I mean, He's no respecter of persons. I think you understand that, but I want everyone else to understand that He's not doing this because, my name is Pastor Jason. No. It's because, like you just said, I was willing to say, yes, Lord, do what you want with me. I'm willing to go wherever, say wherever, love on whoever. And He's just looking for obedience and let Him do the rest. So what God's done with me, He wants to do with everybody. It doesn't mean you have to start a rehab unit or a rehab, ministry. But what does God want to do with your life? That question's on the table. And really your life can be a blank canvas for God to paint some beautiful pictures on. It's overwhelming. It's scary. But it just amazing at the same time. I've never jumped out of an airplane before. I don't know if you have or not. But I would imagine it's similar to the same experience that you can talk about your parachute or you can jump out and try the thing out. And jumping out would be the biggest thrill compared to sitting in a classroom talking about it. And that's what I would say ministry's like. Just jump out, and God's not going to let you fall. It's number one. He loves you. He has it all figured out. Just trust him and have a ride of your life.
Definitely. And I've one thing I've learned throughout my entire life is that when God is in something, he's going to provide, even with this podcast, I felt God tugging on my heart about it. And I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know how to be a host for, a podcast. And, looking at the research into all this is, there's a lot to it. And, whether that be, the equipment, how much it costs and everything, but, God has provided so much for this. And, each person that I talked to leading up to this and, all the brothers that I have, they all gave me, wisdom and, God provided, over $2,000 worth of funds for the podcast. And, he's definitely shown up whenever he's in it. And I can definitely attest to that for sure.
No, that's amazing. I think that is an encouragement to everybody.
What kind of advice would you give to someone that's wanting to be either a volunteer firefighter or making it a full-time career? What would be some advice you'd give to them that you wish you knew prior to doing it?
My advice is to make sure that you, especially if it's a volunteer position, make sure you know how to balance time. Everything in life can steal away time from you, from your family, from all that kind of stuff. So I would say make sure you know what boundaries that you and your family can live with. Okay, you don't know when that call is going to drop. But having those boundaries in place, saying, okay, I may not make every single call. We want to. We strive for that. But there's going to be times that you just can't answer that call. And being okay with that, for the betterment of your family. So I guess the advice was put first things first, okay? Make sure that your family, your heart is in the right place, in a good place. And I think if you do that, things are going to work out a lot better for you in the long run. Not to mention you'll have that support network at home that's not angry at you for leaving all the time. And before you jump into that role of firefighter or volunteer firefighter, have that conversation, because those that's in the house with you, they're also going to have to understand that there's risks involved. There's volunteer or not, there's still a high regard of or high likelihood of injury or even death. So understanding that you're gambling with things that are outside of your control. And that conversation needs to be had with everybody. I didn't realize the toll that it had on everybody until later on in my career. And I talked with my uncle, who's passed away now, and he told me how much it impacts him hearing my stories, knowing what I'm going through. And him and I, we were close. We were real close. But he's not my wife, and I can only imagine what it would do to a wife and children knowing that Dad's stepping into that realm of uncertainty. So just have those real conversations with your family, and weigh out all your options. As great as firefighting was, it's definitely not for everybody. So knowing your own personality traits is also making sure this is a healthy thing for you, that you can work through difficult situations on the go, but also later on, that you're not going to be overwhelmed with it, once you get home.
That's that's good advice. I appreciate that. So I think just in closing, I just kind of a general question. Why God? Why does someone need to follow Jesus? Why would someone need to make that step?
The number one reason, it's to fulfill our purpose in life. Okay. People, the questions that they're normally asked, where did I come from? Why am I here? And where do I go after I die? That's usually the top three questions that people ponder within their lifetime somewhere. Where do we come from? We talked a little bit about that already. God created us, but the purpose behind why we're created is to worship God and to know God. That's the purpose that we're doing that. So why do we need to have a relationship with God? Is to fulfill our purpose. I was alive for many years before I knew Christ personally. I didn't become fully alive until I solidified my relationship with Jesus. That's when things went into the proper motion and order of things. I no longer was selfish. And as I said before, it's not that life is going to be easier when you become a Christian, but it puts things in the right places. That you're putting God first above everything else. That means He's fighting your battles for you, and you're not in there by yourself. For many years, that was me. I was team me, and that was it, right? And I failed miserably. I still got the battle scars to prove it. But now having with my relationship with God, it brings peace in a person's life that you could know no other way. There's nothing else that could possibly replace the peace, the understanding, the purpose that God's brought into my life. So I would say that would be my answer, is why someone needs to. It's because of that peace, but ultimately is because of salvation. No one can come to the Father unless you come through Jesus Christ first. There is a literal hell. There's a literal heaven, and a person gets to make that decision for yourself. When we talk about creation and the mess that we're in, it's not God's fault. It's our fault. He's given us free will to live however we want to live, whether that's with Him or without Him. That's still our free will. So ultimately, if you don't have that relationship with Jesus Christ, you don't call Him Savior, well, then you made your choice, and hell will be your home for eternity. So it's not just about the afterlife, it's about the life here. So when you have the scripture, that life, God gives us a life, and life to the full, or life to the abundance, that's not just afterlife that He's promising us, that's life now. So I think it's a win-win, if we can use that term, for a life that's full of excitement, but also full of peace.
I love that. And, as a kid, the main thing is, I want to go to church because, it's fire insurance, So, yeah,
Yep.
It's really good. So I think now we'll just end in a prayer and then go from there.
Very good.
Sounds good. Lord, we just thank you so much for this time together. In your word, you say that where two or more that gathered, you are here. And I just thank you so much for Pastor Jason coming on and just sharing his stories and his testimony and just giving us, practical wisdom. And just thank you so much for that. I just pray that if there's anybody listening, that you would just tug on their hearts, Lord, and that they would come to know you. And I just thank you for that. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Well, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. Hopefully we'll have you on here in the future.
Look forward to it. Thank you for the opportunity, and God bless you, my brother.
You too.
All right.
Thanks again for listening to another episode of Faith in the Line of Duty. If you're a first responder or in the military and have a story you'd like to share, email me at faithinthelineofduty@gmail.com. You could be a guest on a future episode. To continue the conversation, visit my Facebook and Instagram page. Thanks again for tuning in, and join me next time for another encouraging story of faith in the line of duty.